Social Studies 30-1 here, just wrapping up our look at authoritarian governments, dictatorships. I wanted to critique, evaluate them, so we'll talk about what's good and bad. Advantage number one that came to my mind, rapid decision making. And so we need to understand that in a dictatorship, one person or a handful of people make all the decisions. They don't need consensus. They rule by decree rather than consensus. So, whereas in a democracy, to pass emergency legislation, for example, you need consensus of parliament before you can really do anything. And so I think the Trudeau government in Canada needed parliamentary consent before they passed their COVID emergency response economic package. In a dictatorship, one person can do that on their own without consensus. And so one could make the argument that an advantage of a dictatorship is that you can make quick decisions without debate, without parliamentary consensus, and so on. Brings to mind the Soviet Politburo. Those guys could make fast decisions when you don't have time for democracy. And little known, or we'll learn about it later in chapter 10, that even in democracies, sometimes they will choose to rule by decree rather than debate and consensus, because when you rule by decree, you can decide things fast when time is of the essence. Advantage number two is stability. So in a dictatorship, uh, a dictator can be in power for decades. Stalin ruled the Soviet Union from 1928 to 1953. Fidel Castro, 1959 through 2008. So with that political longevity, you can pass more legislation. You can pass more economic and political reforms rather than being at the whim of the next election that you might not even win. If you know you're going to be there in 20, 30, 40 years, you can pass all kinds of legislation and actually see them through to the end. So just imagine if Barack Obama had been given more than 8 years to be the president of America. Imagine maybe the reforms that he could have passed. Maybe they could finally have got their healthcare system. I mean, we're speculating, we don't know for sure, but one could make the argument that the stability of a dictatorship and what that brings could be more advantageous than in a democracy where a government can be there for 4 years or two or even less. Makes me think of the Weimar Republic in Germany between 1919 and 1930. That government changed 19 times within 10 years, which basically means that government rolled over 2 times a year. That's not political stability, and that handcuffs the government. There's only so much you can do when you're only there for a year or two. Security. Argument number three, security over freedom. And by this I mean, you know, in a democracy, your freedom comes first, and it might come at the expense of your country's security, which would be the opposite in a dictatorship. So when we value security over freedom, you get a strong military. So maybe you can protect and expand your country. Makes me think how readily the former Soviet Union met the basic needs by valuing economic security over individual freedom. As we just learned, Castro's Cuba valued security over freedom, and he was able to give his people universal health care and education. And finally, just the concept of benevolence, and that maybe the will of the people is better met by one person who knows more than they do. I know it's a sketchy, presumptive argument, but maybe a benevolent dictator, someone who had a lot of wisdom and experience and really had the people's best interest in mind, maybe they could do a better job um, in meeting the will of the people, giving them what is better for them, what is best for them. Economic growth is my next one that I thought of. And by this I mean that in a dictatorship, when a government can control and direct the economy without worrying about individualism, maybe you can serve your country better this way. So it makes me think of Stalin's 5-year plans and how he focused everything on rapid industrialization. And they did rapidly industrialize. Makes me think of Hitler's remilitarization beginning in 1933 and how very quickly he rebuilt their army, their navy, their air force, and then went on a campaign of expansionism. Makes me think of Zedong's Great Leap Forward, in which they rapidly industrialized. And makes me think of Putin's economic recovery for Russia when he took over in 2000. The economy was in chaos. And within a few years, he had set it on the right course and they recovered economically. Now, in all of these cases, I'm overlooking the bad things that go with dictatorships. And there are a lot of bad things that we need to talk about. So, disadvantages, well, number one, these governments are not accountable. In other words, you didn't pick them, you can't get rid of them, at least not legally. So when there's lack of accountability, they don't need to abide by the rule of law. Governments that are unaccountable to the people are above the rule of law, and as we've seen, they can impose upon your rights and freedoms. So in these systems, they don't have elections. We'll learn more about the vote of non-confidence and checks and balances next week, but they don't have them. And so what you could get is a dictator who runs amok and does whatever he wants, um, regardless of how it affects his population. And we've seen lots of examples of that. Number two, there's lack of a political opposition. So even if they do have elections, and they still do because they want to give the appearance of being legitimate and credible. But even when they have elections, you can only really pick for that one party. These are all one party states. So there's no political plurality, there's no choice, there are no political alternatives, and there's no one to act as a watchdog. So, in other words, there's no official opposition in government. There's just the one ruling party, and that's all. Um, and now there's no accountability and there's no rule of law. Human rights abuses. Dictatorships are notorious for this. Suppression of rights and freedoms. They're sacrificing individuals for the collective good. But who are they to decide what the collective good is? Who are they to decide what is better for you? I thought you should be the one making that choice. You're forced to conform. They're notorious for scapegoating. It makes me think of the Jews and the kulaks and the Holocaust and Holodomor, the Cultural Revolution, mass murder. All of those things are the downside of dictatorships. Um, Human rights abuse, huge argument against them. Strong censorship of the media that we've looked at a lot, and you learned about that in grade 11 as well. And number five, I just thought it was worth talking about the lack of legitimacy. In other words, why are they a dictator? Why was Mao Zedong the leader of China? Like, did people vote for him? No. Did they pick him? No. So why was he the leader? Like, what credentials did he have to lead that country of millions of people? Um, so say what you want about democratic leaders, at least we got to pick them. And even if we don't like them, their power's legitimate. The people voted for them. The people picked them. That's what I mean by legitimacy. Authoritarian regimes do not have legitimate leaders. They're not credible. Are they just bullies? Do they have the loyalty of the military? Does that make them good leaders? Well, I don't know. That's something that you would need to explore. Finally, number six, they always come with ultranationalist visions, and you learned this back in 20-1. And by that, I just mean that usually these regimes lead to conflict because they want to expand at someone else's expense, and that always leads to war, conflict, and so on. And finally, number seven, with them always comes a profound amount of indoctrination, elitism, propaganda. Usually these regimes are always fascist. They're very elitist, and they don't tell people the truth. They hide the truth. They lie to their populations outright. Um, and people should deserve the truth. People can probably handle the truth. So there you are. There is a very quick survey overview of what is good and bad about authoritarian regimes. You'll want to keep those things in mind for the next position paper, which is still a couple of weeks off, but time to start thinking about that. That's why I put this presentation together. Hope you got something out of it.